Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so my name is Robert Soden. I'm a postdoc in computer science here at Columbia, and today I'm going to be talking briefly about the mutual aid response to COVID from the perspective of crisis informatics, which is my field of study. So New Yorkers from all over the city, though many of us are at home and physical distancing, are nonetheless finding ways to connect and support one another. Around the city right now, dozens, if hundreds of local mutual aid groups are being organized at the scale of neighborhood, block, or even in some cases, individual building. These groups are organizing to pool funds, run errands, mobilize politically, and some other activities. They're using technologies that range from Facebook to Nextdoor to Slack to even paper flyers and so on. And they are they're connecting, they're recruiting volunteers, and working to match the skills and resources of their networks with the kinds of needs that are emerging at the community level as a result of the pandemic. I think because of the nature of these activities, it's really impossible to fully capture the scale of the work that's going on right now. But suffice to say that there are thousands of people involved. One group in one neighborhood in Brooklyn right now counts over 750 members. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, being raised right now through these local community organizations, and just countless of other activities going on. So I come at this from the background of crisis informatics. And crisis informatics is a multidisciplinary field that combines computing and social science knowledge of disaster. We draw on computer and information science, as well as anthropology and the sociology of disasters and organizational studies, in order to understand, both from a social science and a technology design perspective, the relationship between technology and people during emergencies. And so in the past, we've looked a lot at how people use technology to come together, both online and offline, to support one another during disasters. And indeed, community self-help is common during emergencies. So contrary to popular narrative or myths about community being helpless victims or engaging in rioting and looting behavior, many decades of disaster research have shown that in fact, on the contrary, people typically exhibit pro-social behavior, behave calmly, rationally, and often altruistically during emergencies. And I want to call out mutual aid right now as a distinct and possibly growing discourse and set of practices in this arena. Mutual aid, we should recognize, as a long tradition in the United States, going back to the labor movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. But I think a lot of current manifestations really call back to some of the work of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s with the breakfast program, for example, in Oakland, California, and other cities, which really tied the work of meeting the material needs of marginalized and oppressed communities to political education and mobilization. This is really distinct from other forms of disaster volunteering or neighborhood support networks that we've seen that are so ubiquitous during disasters. Mutual aid really seeks to emphasize solidarity over charity and really builds a long-term community relationship towards political change. And while we have seen mutual aid being deployed in prior disasters, such as in Katrina, in New Orleans, or the Occupy Sandy movement here in the New York region, the extent to which community response activities are being framed as such right now and happening in so many different parts of the country simultaneously I do believe this is new, and thus really important to look at from crisis informatics and disaster studies more broadly. I'll say that I haven't launched a formal research program in this area right now. I'm kind of doing in the process of formative research. I'm quite involved with a couple of mutual aid groups in my neighborhood and studying how they're happening across New York and the rest of the country. And I'm going to talk just briefly today about some of the observations from this work so far. So first, there's a couple of broad categories of assistance that these groups are working to provide their members. As I mentioned, there's a lot of fundraising happening to help neighbors pay rent, buy groceries, or just provide direct cash assistance to folks that have lost income or for whatever reason are struggling at the moment. There's a lot of errand running happening for neighbors, including doing things like delivering groceries and prescriptions for folks that are high risk or otherwise would find it difficult to do these things for themselves. There's a lot of political mobilization happening right now, and in particular, I would want to call out a lot of work being done by the Prison Abolition Network around releasing people from the very unsafe conditions in jails and prisons right now. And then you have other groups that are just doing things like holding happy hours, volunteering to call in and check in on people who live alone, and just doing other kinds of things to provide emotional support and a sense of community. And then finally, from a crisis informatics perspective, there's a lot of really interesting information sharing happening right now. And I think, maybe as distinct from a lot of the COVID data dashboards and other kind of formal government websites that are out there right now, we're seeing that people are looking for things like what kinds of social service agencies are open in my neighborhood right now, what businesses are open and delivering, which one of those are currently stocked in groceries and other kinds of goods, who in my neighborhood is at risk, and how could I reach out to them and help them, what kinds of government services am I eligible for. Right now we're seeing a lot of people filing for unemployment for the first time in their lives and really struggling to do so. So the kinds of information needs that are being sort of expressed and met through these mutual aid networks are again quite different from a lot of the COVID dashboards and government websites that we're seeing. And I think that's also something that's interesting and that we should be attending to. Next, just briefly, in terms of the kinds of tools and technologies that people are using, really matches a pattern of behavior that we've seen in past disasters in crisis informatics, where we don't see a lot of development or meaningful deployment of new apps or tools in the midst of this, but instead we find a lot of innovative and really quite creative cobbling together of everyday technologies that people are already accustomed to. So again, we have people using things like Facebook and Google Docs, Google Forms, paper flyers, and neighborhood phone trees to develop really quite complex volunteer management, case tracking systems. And really interestingly, and this is perhaps driven by the kind of very local parallel ways in which these groups are working, we're seeing really interesting and creative solutions being developed by one group in one part of the network, then quickly propagating across other groups in other parts of the city where local groups are kind of picking these up, experimenting with them, and deploying them in their own work. Quickly, just some of the challenges, and as you can imagine, there's many, but I want to just touch on a few, and in particular, this first one. Who's being included and involved in these mutual aid communities, and who's being left out? Are these groups successful in reaching some of the most affected and vulnerable members of their neighborhoods, such as the houseless folks, the elderly, contingent workers that may not live in the neighborhood, but nonetheless are very important parts? Certainly the racial and class divisions that exist prior to COVID are showing up here as well, and really shaping who gets connected to the networks and how these networks are formed. And indeed, technologies like Facebook and Slack and email are really powerful tools to build social networks, but also lead to their own kinds of exclusions. And so the design of these technologies that the groups are using, along with the strategies that the organizers are mobilizing to deploy them, is going to be really important in terms of the success of these groups and developing meaningful mutual aid strategies. Next, I'll kind of skip over this, but as you can imagine, coordination between local groups is really difficult right now, and there's some interesting reasons related to both their organizing strategies and the technologies that they're using. But then third, I think a big challenge is that just the need is so massive. I think we're all aware that the number of people that are losing their jobs right now, in many cases, that their health insurance is astronomical and really stretching the ability of these groups to meet the needs of their members. And again, as a result, many of the mutual aid groups are looking to the kind of structural causes of vulnerability that got us here in the first place, pointing to the
1 minute, Mark.
Sure, economic and racial dimensions of the pandemic. And so it's going to be really interesting and important to see how well these groups can move the needle on some of these issues, as well as how well they can convert current organizing to longer term political pressure to address these structural issues at a structural level. I'll skip this and just close and say again that mutual aid as a discourse and set of practices is really shaping how the kinds of community self-help that we see in so many disasters is really playing out right now in this pandemic. And this raises a bunch of really important both basic social science, but as well as technology design research questions for crisis informatics and disaster studies. I'm part of a network of researchers being organized by the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who is looking at these current mutual aid activities from a variety of perspectives, computer science, social science, public health, and so on. This is an open group, so if this is of interest to you or you're currently conducting related research, please reach out and we'd love to involve you. And then finally, if you're involved in these activities in your own neighborhoods or would like to be, I would also ask you to get in touch. I'd be interested to connect with other people around Columbia that are thinking about this and working in this way. Thank you very much.